Chapter 6 Sisters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. Sisters by Ada Cambridge. Chapter 6. He mentioned it next day, however. He had to, for after breakfast a letter, forwarded from Five Creeks, reached him from the baby's caretaker, the lady of whom he stood in such undignified dread. The sight of her handwriting paled his brown face and set his stout heart fluttering. What did she want of him? He kept the letter unopened for some time, because he was afraid to know, although convinced beforehand that he did know that, of course, it was the visit he should have paid before coming up country. When at last he drew the sheet from its envelope, as if it had come from an infected house, and had not been fumigated, and cast a hurried glance over the contents, he found the unexpected had happened once more, the wildly unexpected. She was going to be married. He was a general merchant in prosperous business, and there was nothing to wait for except Mr Carey's instructions as to what was to be done with the dear little boy. She would feel acutely the parting from him, after he had been from his birth like a child of her own, but Mr Carey would understand that she could not now continue her labour of love on his behalf, that she had others to consider. But she knew of a most excellent substitute, a dear friend of her own, who had long taken the deepest interest in darling Harry, and with whom she was sure he would be as safe and happy as with herself. She had expected to see Mr Carey when he arrived, to arrange matters. She hoped he would come as soon as possible. In the bewilderment of his mingled elation and anxieties, the young father did not know what to do for the moment, while recognizing the urgent need for action. He must go as soon as possible, of course, but he could not depart suddenly without a reason, and to give the reason would be to give himself away to Alice Urquhart. Besides, a day's outing had been planned on purpose for him. The possibilities in connection with it were enormous, and 5 days of his leave were unexpended still. He must think it over. He must have advice. So, as a first instalment of duty, he scrawled a recklessly affectionate letter, full of gratitude to her who had been his good genius and the guardian angel of his boy. He did not disguise his envy at the general merchant, whose vows of love could not have excelled in fervent expression the good wishes of the writer for the happiness of the betrothed pair. He hoped to have the pleasure of seeing his dear old friend on the following day, or the day after that at latest, and he promised himself the satisfaction of squandering his saved pay on such a wedding present as would at least cover the cost of the bread and milk the boy had devoured at her expense. Guthrie dropped his letter in the post-bag while they were calling to him that it was time to start, and he turned the key of silence upon his secret until he could pour it into the right ear. It was a wonder he did not pour it into Mary's, for she drove him to Bundaboo, and nobody could have been more sympathetic than she. She was the virtual mother of the family, who loved children, and she was not, she could not be, a husband hunter. A sensible man in domestic difficulties could not have sought a wiser confidant. Yet he resisted stubbornly all her gentle invitations to confide. In the first place, he did not want to go with her in the pony carriage, while Deb and Dalzell rode. He did not like to see it taken for granted, as it seemed to be by all, that a sailor on horseback must necessarily make a fool of himself. The slight to his self-respect was enough to dull the edge of his joy in the general merchant's proceedings, for, as the reader will remember, he was still but 23. He had to weigh down the springs of the little basket thing no better than an invalid's wheelchair, and see the young exquisite, whom he could have tossed over his shoulder with one hand, show off feats of fancy horsemanship to make Deb's dark eyes kindle. Mr Pennycuick had carelessly asked Billy's degenerate son to "school a bit", a creature which for weeks had not allowed a man upon his back, and had had no exercise beyond his voluntary scamperings about the paddock from which he had been brought, dancing with excitement and indignation. All the stablemen had been required to get his bridle and saddle on. He now wheeled round and round in the large space left for him, while Claud Dalzell, in his London riding clothes, and with his air of a reigning prince, warily turned with him. Guthrie Carey, in the waiting pony carriage, had but one interest in the performance, his hopeful anticipation of a fatal, or at least a ridiculous, result. But there was no fear of that, and evidently Deb knew it. Sitting her own dancing chestnut, how her beautiful eyes glowed! She gloried in the ring of breathless witnesses to the prowess of her knight. Many a time did she scoff and scowl at the dandyisms which she seemed effeminate. This was one of the moments which showed the man as she desired him. Through those fine fingers, with the polished filbert nails, the shortened reins were drawn and held as by clamps of steel. So was the wild-eyed head by the lock of mane in the same hand. When no one was looking, although every eye believed itself fixed upon him, his left foot found its stirrup, his right gave a hop, and like lightning he had sprung up and round, without touching the horse until fairly down in the saddle, so that the animal was robbed of his best chance of getting the rider off, which is at the moment before he is quite on. No other chance was offered to the baffled one, although he kicked like a demon for nearly 10 minutes. "I wish," Guthrie Carey ground through his strong teeth, "that the cranky beast would break his neck. It was not the beast's neck he meant." But Deb called, "Bravo! Well done, indeed!" and when the battle was over, called the victor to her with her lovely face of pride and joy. Right willingly he went, and they sailed away together like the wind, and were lost to view. Yes, this was Dalzell's hour. She knew nothing of the brave deeds of sailor men common and constant as eating and drinking, and performed to no audience and for no reward. Alice Urquhart and Rose Pennycuick, also on horseback, followed the flying pair. Then a buggy containing Jim and schoolgirl Francie, her governess gone home for holidays to-day, and a load of ironwork for a blacksmith on the route. Last of all, Mary and the sailor, for all the world like the old father and mother of the party. Mr Pennycuick excused himself from the excursions nowadays, and so did Miss Keene, the elderly and quite uninfluential duenna of the house. When one was needed, she did the flowers and knitted singlets for everybody. The Shetlands pattered along at a great rate, but did not come up with the riders until they were nearly at Bundaboo. And all the way, a long way, Guthrie Carey had to make efforts not to bore his hostess. They talked about the clear air and the dun-coloured land, the richest sheep country in the colony, but now without a blade of green upon it, and made comments upon 3 bullock drays piled with wool bales, and 2 camping sundowners, and 1 Chinaman hawker's cart, which they encountered on the way, and that was about all. The home coming was a different affair. Tea had been